Hello, travelers. Welcome. I am Andrew Schultz. I am a producer with Shaka Guide, and I'm joined by my friend here, Matt Caracciolo. He's a writer and an editor for Shaka Guide as well. How's it going, Matt?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm excited to talk to you today. We are going to dive into an interesting story that we've got featured on our Olympic National Park tour from Shaka Guide. It's not actually really about the park itself, but it is about a person who grew up really close to the park, essentially a local hero. It ties into a larger story centered around the 1936 Olympics. Now, you guys listening out there might have heard about this story. You might be familiar with it a bit from the 2013 book by Daniel James Brown called The Boys in the Boat, which did get turned into a pretty big movie in 2023. So, it's a pretty well-known story, but there's lots of little details to dive into. I think it's particularly relevant to the moment right now because the 2026 Winter Olympics are in Milan. And we've got our resident expert on Italy and soon-to-be traveler, Matt, here. Are you excited about the games?
I am. The reason Andrew's bringing it up is because I am going to the Olympics, which I am very excited about. My first Olympics.
Yes, so we can all collectively be jealous of Matt here as he gets to go travel to Italy and experience the Olympics. And I think you said you're going to watch a couple of events, right?
Yeah, we're going to go to 2 hockey games and a speed skating final. I can't tell you how stoked I am to see somebody win a gold medal in person.
Yeah.
That'll just be amazing.
These athletes dedicate their entire lives to something. This is why it's so fun to watch the Olympics. It's a culminating moment for elite athletes to make it to this stage, and then to potentially win gold would be like the pinnacle of their success in this field. And to be able to witness a moment like that has got to be emotional.
I can't wait.
Yes, get out of here now. So it felt like a good time to talk about a story about the Olympics, and that is the story of Joe Rantz. So, Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about who Joe Rantz is?
Yeah, so Joe Rantz is one of the members of the men's rowing team in the 1936 Olympics. And the reason that he is part of our Olympic National Park tour is that he spent a good amount of his childhood in a nearby town called Sequim. When you look at the word Sequim, it looks like it says Sequim, but I believe it is pronounced Sequim.
You're correct. Yes. I remember when we were producing this tour, we talked about this a lot. It just being fun to say as well. Sequim.
Yeah, I can say Sequim all day.
So he's from the area of Sequim, which is pretty close to Olympic National Park. It's on the Olympic Peninsula, western Washington state. At this time in the 1930s, what is that area like?
Yeah, so it's pretty remote. So Olympic National Park is there today. It wasn't a national park at the time. It was a national monument. So it wasn't necessarily a big tourist draw at the time like it is now. And just in general, I don't think Washington as a whole state is a very populous area yet. Obviously, you have Seattle and Tacoma and those places, but they're not giant. Generally speaking, it's a kind of remote area. And then Sequim is the remote area of the remote area.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I lived in Seattle a few years myself, and Sequim and Port Angeles and the cities that surround the current entrance area of Olympic National Park and the Olympic mountain ranges, it's a totally different world. Even by today's standard, I'd say it's more small town, foresty and a little bit rural in a sense compared to a big city like Seattle. So I'd imagine at that time especially, it felt even more disconnected from mainstream USA. Joe Rantz grows up in this area. What is Joe Rantz's childhood like?
Joe Rantz has been described as good-natured, diligent. He liked to play guitar. Pretty solid kid, but he had a rough childhood. His mother died when he was young, and his father remarried to this woman who just did not like him at all. And I don't know specifically why, but she was more focused on her children than him, to the point where she wouldn't even let him stay in the house. Sometimes he slept in a schoolhouse for at least a year. Yeah. And then at age 15, the entire family actually packed up and left to go live somewhere else without Joe. His father just did not have the capability to keep that family together in a way that included Joe. And so Joe basically, as a sophomore in high school, started raising himself. Did odd jobs to keep himself fed. He lived in a half-finished cabin in the woods, but he still went to school. He kept his grades up. I don't know how you can get to be more of a solid person than that, to go through all that and still be pretty put together.
Yeah. Kudos to Joe. That sounds really rough. And I think at one point his father maybe tried to bring him back home for a little bit, but it was short lived. His stepmom wasn't having it. So maybe at some point his father cared a little bit about him, but it feels like a lonely and a struggle of an experience for Joe as a child. And yet he's doing really impressive things. He's playing guitar. He's described as being smart and good at school, even though he's living on his own as a kid. That's already a pretty impressive life experience to have.
And when he's a teenager, this is the Great Depression too. So on top of all that, and that might be one factor why his mom didn't want him around, is I've got my kids. I need to take care of my kids with my limited resources. Now that's a great excuse, but that might have been where her brain was at the time.
I think that possibly could be it for sure. He's an athlete in high school. I believe he does a little gymnastics. Maybe he's on a few different sports teams. But he actually, was it during high school that he reconnects with his older brother?
Yeah, so one of his older brothers does invite him to live with them in Seattle. So his senior year, he does get to enjoy a more typical high school lifestyle where he's got a stable home. He can just focus on his grades and extracurriculars instead of trying to find something to eat. So that's definitely a leg up his senior year in high school with his brother.
Yeah. Basically, it was a brother that his father had much earlier. So he had already grown up, and I believe his brother had a wife of his own at that time. It's nice Joe gets to just be a kid for a little bit. He gets a short little window there where he doesn't have to fend for himself quite as much. And he thrives even more so. He was thriving in the bad conditions, so he does even better, I think, once he has a little bit of help. And basically, he's such a great athlete in high school that he gets noticed, right, by some possible recruiters from the University of Washington.
That's right. So he's on the gymnastics team, and the University of Washington rowing coach is at the high school for another reason, but he happens to see Joe practicing gymnastics and thinks that he would be a good addition to the rowing team. And yeah, he does recruit him to come to the University of Washington.
Yeah, essentially sees Joe, I think it's 6'2", 6'3", really muscular. You could see, some old pictures of him online if you look up Joe Rantz, and you can immediately tell he was an athlete.
It's hard to imagine somebody 6'3" on a gymnastics team. I feel like gymnasts are usually on the shorter side. So 6'3", that must have been something.
That's probably what that recruiter thought. You're in the wrong sport. We got to put you in a boat, put you to use.
Look at that wingspan. You could use that rowing a boat.
Exactly. That's just good. That's good recruiting there. He essentially encourages Joe to try out for the UW rowing team. He still had to work his way into school and onto the team. It wasn't a done deal just because he was seen, right?
Right, and he had to raise the money to get to college too. It's not like he got a full scholarship or anything like that. Yeah, he did spend some time making some money before going on to college. And then, he got himself onto the rowing team once he got there.
Right. So we basically established Joe Rantz grows up small rural part of Washington. He's living near the area around Olympic National Park, but has some connections with Seattle. Eventually does where he went to high school is in Seattle when he's living with his brother. That's where he becomes a really excellent athlete, gets discovered, works his way into UW, works his way onto the UW rowing team. That's where the story kind of opens up a bit, because this is already a really impressive personal path, but he's about to become part of a much bigger story of a group of young men who defy the odds in the sport of rowing at large. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about what happens after Joe Rantz is on the UW rowing team. What happens to that team?
Yeah, you're right. At this point, it's not really just Joe's story, it's the team's story. Even though he's the main character of the book, it's not called The Boy in the Boat. It's The Boys in the Boat. And pretty much everyone on this team, it's like Joe, maybe they didn't have such a rough childhood, but they're coming from working class families. They're coming from farms. They're coming from fishing families, logging families, that sort of thing. So they've got that kind of work ethic behind them.
Yeah.
But they're all kind of underdogs in the same way. And it's not to lean too hard into a stereotype, but when you think of rowing teams, you don't normally think of guys that are coming from logging and fishing families. You're thinking of the Winklevi twins and the Social Network out east in these prestigious places like Harvard and Yale. And that's what their competition looks like for UW. They're competing against these established elite teams that are mostly out on the East Coast, and they're winning anyways. And they actually, I don't know the total ins and outs of how the Olympic qualifiers worked back then, but essentially the UW rowing team, by defeating all these other more elite East Coast teams, earned the spot on the Olympic team as the official men's rowing team for the 1936 Olympics.
That's incredible. I totally agree with the perception of the sport. I think that's even true today. You said the Harvard Winklevoss twins. To this day, it's a sport that gets a lot of rich people, for lack of a better word, people who are privileged and have a lot of money and have a pathway to train all the time and get really into the weeds on the specifics of the sport. And then here in UW, we've got people who are excelling because they grew up in circumstances that really just made them really tough and really strong. And it's inspiring to see that grittiness and tough upbringing and the strength that came from that, overcoming what could be described as power from money or success from money. That's generalizing, but for the most part, it feels the case here. And then the fact that they qualify for the Olympics is crazy because of how remote UW really is, even today, but especially at that time. The center of the United States is really the Northeast. It's New York. It's the capital area. For a team on the very upper left-hand corner of the map to be able to pull through and defeat everybody else to win that spot is pretty awesome. So at this point, they defy the odds and they get a spot. They're qualified to compete in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, but it's all the way in Berlin. So logistically, that's not an easy thing to make happen. So actually, it's not even a done deal at this point. Just because they qualified doesn't mean they're actually going yet.
That's right. I guess the Olympic Committee was short on funds. So even though they'd qualified, they did not actually have the money to go. And so what ended up happening was the Seattle community supported them. The Seattle community ended up rallying behind the UW rowing team between the radio and newspapers and volunteers going door to door knocking. They said, look, our boys need help. They need money to actually go to Berlin. And in 2 days, they raised over $5,000. And I looked it up because $5,000 may not sound all that much. It's still a lot today in 2 days, just by a community effort.
Yeah.
Without social media, without a Kickstarter. But $5,000 in those days was something over $100,000. So they raised $100,000 in 2 days.
That's insane.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think 5,000 is a lot. I don't know if I could pull together 5,000 in the next 2 days for something by myself. So the fact that's essentially $100,000 of equivalent value is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, in the Great Depression.
In the Great Depression, too. Yeah.
People don't have much to give, but they gave anyway.
Exactly. Just speaks to how inspiring this journey is, and to people who were in that community at the time, recognized what Joe Rantz and these other boys on the team did and where they came from. And everyone collectively decided, you know what, these guys deserve to go. They've been through a lot and they've earned it. We can all pull together to make it happen. That's pretty awesome. So they raise the money. The community comes together. The UW team is going to the Olympics in Berlin. This is 1936 in Berlin. So obviously the Nazis are becoming a regime that is becoming more and more well known. At this point, not a whole lot is known about the atrocities that are going to be happening soon, but they're seen as a rising political power. This is a really unique Olympic Games in history. Maybe just describe what's going on in the world. When this team itself comes to the Olympics, a lot of people are coming together in Berlin, and it's a complicated period of history, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a really weird Olympics. It's interesting, but for all the wrong reasons. You said World War II hasn't started yet, obviously, but people are starting to become a little concerned about what Nazis are all about. But the Nazis decide to hide some of their anti-Semitic efforts and really try to present Berlin as this very clean and efficient place, and that the Nazi regime are on the up and up. See how great things are when we're in charge. So it's all one big propaganda piece.
Yeah.
So that's one interesting aspect. Another interesting aspect is that it's the first Olympic Games to be televised, albeit to a small, I believe, Berlin only audience. But that's interesting that some of these events were televised live for people to see. But then people do know that the Nazis are white supremacists. And so the other kind of big Olympic story for the 1936 games is Jesse Owens, which where I'm from in Columbus is a big name because he went to Ohio State. And if you go to Ohio State, then you might exercise at the Jesse Owens gym, the JO North, JO South. Jesse Owens, an African-American man, has a great Olympic Games right under the nose of Adolf Hitler. So that's another big story happening at the same time as the boys in the boat.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned this was one of the first times that we've got some televised events for the Olympics, maybe the first time. And there wasn't a whole lot filmed, but there was actually some footage of the rowing race that we're going to talk about in a minute. It was also a really globally accessible event because of radio. We talked about radio being really important, I think, in the process of Seattle as a town coming together to raise the money. Radio was a big part of that campaign, I think. And I think I saw that radio broadcast at least the rowing event that we're going to talk about to over 300 million people, which is pretty huge. It's a really interesting time technologically and for media. So the convergence of these different variables does make for a really interesting moment. So let's narrow in on the rowing event specifically, because that's the reason why Joe Rantz and the UW team are heading to Berlin. What are the expectations in this event at this Olympics? Who are the favorites? How are we expecting our U.S. team to do?
Yeah, so as the home team, obviously Germany is favored to win. The Americans have had good teams in the past. I was kind of looking up how many goals had we had up to that point. We'd actually done pretty well up to 1936. So it's not that we were total underdogs. But you've got the home team, Germany. You've got Great Britain in there, which again, thinking of elite upper crust places like Oxford or Cambridge, they've probably got guys like that on their team.
Right.
And so I think the Americans are probably considered to be in the mix, but maybe not the favorites.
And with Germany being probably the favorites, and as you mentioned, the Nazi regime wanting to use this event as propaganda, essentially, somebody very important is actually going to show up and watch this event in person. And who else could it be?
Adolf Hitler. Yeah, so the rowing team qualifies for the final. And so the final happens along this river, 75,000 people in the stands, and among them is not just Hitler, but a lot of the top Nazis. They get this balcony seat, and they're getting ready for the race to start.
So, this is setting up to be a very interesting race on a very interesting global scene. It's a pretty big moment for some college boys from remote Washington State, I would say, but we're going to pause it right here. Click on the video for part 2 to join us for the big race in the next video, and we'll see you there.